we are going to begin. It was called for 10 o'clock today as opposed to a little earlier because of Rosh Chodesh. The services, the prayer services, lasted a little longer, and I was afraid I wouldn't be on time. So, yesterday we read Vayakhel and Pekudei. It was actually two parshas together, two Torah portions together. And the reason they are together, sometimes they're portions that are together, is because there are more Torah portions than there exist weeks. So I think there's a total of 54, maybe 55 Torah portions, and there are only 52 weeks in the year. Plus, when a holiday falls out over Shabbat, for example, Passover, when it's the Shabbat of Passover, we don't read the regular one. We suspend that until the next week. So essentially, there's about probably 49 or 48, 50, I don't know exactly, weeks that we could read, and 54 portions. So some of them are together. How do they choose which ones are together? So that was the sages did that. So they wouldn't just put randomly two parshas together. There was a method to it. And so this week, the first parsha is called Vayakhel, and Moses gathered, which shows the community aspect, the positivity, and the importance of community. But next week, the second parsha, which was sometimes together, sometimes not, is Pekudei, which is basically counting individuals. Moses counted exactly how much gold was brought in, exactly how much silver, exactly how much purple wool and scarlet wool, etc. Which that does not show any longer community. That shows individuality. And you put them together to teach us a lesson that there's importance in community, but we should never lose the individual power that we have. It's not all about the community. So it's community, individuality is important, community is important, and you need both. You can't be, so socialistic that you forget about the individual. Right? There's the greater good, the sacrifice for the greater good, but at the same time, charity starts at home. So the Torah portion begins, and Moses gathered the Jewish people, and he said to them, first and foremost, you got to keep Shabbat. So even though the next 100 verses deal with the building of the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the temple, in the desert, nonetheless, none of this building violates Shabbat. None of it. And in fact, the building of the Mishkan is suspended because of Shabbat. And from here, the sages learn, because of the juxtaposition of the verses, Shabbat, building temple, is whatever was done in the holy temple, we learn, is prohibited to do on Shabbat. That's how we know what the definition of work is, right? So he says 6 days a week you should do work, implying the building of the temple, which was writing and building and hammering and mixing and grinding. And all these things you're not allowed to do because they're called malacha, they're called work. And so, anything to do with the holy temple. So we cannot sow, we cannot plow, we cannot we cannot water to get the spices, to grow the spices that will be offered on the holy temple. And there's 39 in total. The Torah tells us 6 days shall work be done. It's written passively. Not 6 days shall you work, but 6 days shall work be done. That the one should, yes, it's true, you have to work, you have to make a living, you're obligated to provide for your family, you're obligated to work to give charity, you're obligated to be a productive member of society as opposed to relying on the dole or relying on the next stimulus check. You're obligated to work. However, you need to control your work, and you cannot let your work control you. So, passive. And this is actually the interesting part. Friday afternoon, 2 hours before Shabbat, you got to pull away. You cannot, must not say, well, it's such an important meeting, and I got to end the week on a high note. And if I make one last sale, I would be, I'm going to get a bonus. Can't think that way. It's 2 hours before Shabbat. You got to close your computer, put on your jacket, take your briefcase, get in your car, and go home. Right? If you cannot do that, then it's no longer passive. Then your work controls you. If you cannot stop, and you do not visit your kids' football game or anything, you cannot make the date with your spouse because you're at work and you could not pull away. This doesn't even mean Shabbat. Then you're too enmeshed, and your business controls you as opposed to you controlling your business. Alternatively, 6 days shall work be done, and the seventh day shall be holy. The sages teach here that 6 days shall work be done. You'll be blessed in the 6 days if you keep Shabbat. If Shabbat is holy to you, God will take note, and he will bless you in the other 6 days. And then the last thing the Torah says about Shabbat is lo sabaru eish, do not kindle a fire on Shabbat. So there's different commentaries as to what that means. So generally speaking, Shabbat, you're not allowed to work. Your spouse is not allowed to work. Your brother-in-law is not allowed to work. And worst of all, your mother-in-law is not allowed to work. That has the ability, when people are not working and they're not busy, and instead of enjoying Shabbat, you get into family feuds and tempers fly. Blood boils. So the Torah is telling us, even though you're not allowed to work, take it easy. Le sabaru eish. Shabbat is a time of peace, not a time of war. Another explanation is that the Torah used specifically fire because if you think about it, that you are one of the easiest things to do once you have your fire going is to throw another log on the fire. Right? The fire is going. You made it before Shabbat. What is so difficult? Why does this destroy some eternal plan? I can't believe God would mind me throwing this log on the fire in order to keep my house warm. So the Torah is telling us that even though it may be the easiest thing, most simple thing, it's still malacha, it's still work. And this is how it plays out. Work is not necessarily your understanding of work. Work is God's understanding of work. So on Shabbat, we know when we're not allowed to turn on a light switch on Shabbat. Now, if you think about it, you're not allowed to turn on a light switch, but you are allowed to drag a table for extra guests from the 16th floor to the 3rd floor in order to set up a table for guests. Now, that table you're dragging will make you sweat. Turning on the light switch, however, with your pinky will not make you sweat. So you can argue, well, that's work and that's not work. So the Torah tells you, no. Le sabaru eish. Even if it creates a small spark, which nowadays I don't even know if it does, with the low voltage wiring. But even if it creates a smaller spark, you can't do it because it's God's definition of work, not man's definition. So even turning on a light switch, you're not going to draw sweat. No matter, you cannot do it. It's interesting. Based on this verse, Le sabaru eish, do not kindle a fire of any sort. So there were this group of people who kept the Torah literally. And therefore, they did not have this concept of as soon as Shabbat about to come in, they extinguished the flame of their fire, their they used this fireplace to warm up, but they extinguished it. Why? Because the Torah says you shall not kindle fire. The rabbis explained in the oral law, you're allowed to have a fire on Shabbat. You're allowed to keep warm. You're allowed to keep the food warm. You're just not, once Shabbat comes in, you're not allowed to touch anything. You're not allowed to add to the fire. You are not allowed to add to the fire. But you're allowed to keep the fire burning. But there were these Karaites who said no. And therefore on Shabbat, they lived in the cold. And they never had hot food. They had, they had challah and salads, right? They didn't have a kugel or a cholent or anything like that. So here is actually the origin of the cholent. So the cholent is a dish that's put on the flame Friday afternoon, and it slow bakes overnight. And then Shabbat, for lunch, you have this warm food. It was instituted by the rabbis thousands of years ago to teach us, don't be a Karaite. They're not correct. They're not correct. A Karaite who says you're not allowed to have hot food is incorrect. You are allowed to indeed have hot food. You got to put it in the oven. You got to turn on the button, the temperature, desired temperature, and leave it until you're ready. When you're ready, take it out and eat it. You're not allowed to put it back because once the temperature's cold, you can't put it back. But to warm, conceptually, to have warm food on Shabbat is a beautiful thing. And that's why cholent, kugel, it's the same idea, was actually a dish that the rabbis encouraged us to eat on Shabbat. They were also probably paid for by the cardiologists in order to gain more business. Torah continues. The Torah says that it's time to build this Mishkan. So this took place. It was the day after Yom Kippur. Moses finally got forgiveness, elicited forgiveness from God about the sin of the golden calf. He came down on Yom Kippur when he finally got the forgiveness, and this was the day after Yom Kippur. Moses gathered the Jewish people and said, okay, I've gained forgiveness. However, the relationship has changed, and we need to build a sanctuary for God, a place where God can rest. So the dynamic had changed. And Moses says that everybody should donate gold, and silver, and copper, and blue wool, and purple wool, and scarlet wool, and silk, and linen, and different types of skin from animals, etc., and stones and precious stones, and you should bring them to Bezalel. You should bring it to the architect, and he'll be able to make all the artifacts that are needed in the Holy Temple. So they brought gold, they brought silver. Now the reason why there was gold and silver and copper is because the holy sanctuary, the tabernacle, it atoned for every type of person. It atoned for a golden Jew that usually doesn't mess up or never messes up and is just bringing a peace offering. It atones for the silver Jew, who sometimes commits an infraction, most times not. It atones for the copper type of Jew, which is perhaps has more infractions than the silver type of Jew, and on and on and on. The temple was there for all peoples. It wasn't there just for the elite. It wasn't there just for the sinners. It was there for all types. And therefore, every artifact in the Holy Temple represented a different type of person. And they took these, and with their, I mean, there was such talent here. There was such talent. They were able to intertwine these gold and silver. The Talmud tells us is that they beat the gold into a very, very thin piece of gold. And then they micro cut it into thin strips. And it became like a piece of wool. Maybe it wasn't as flexible as wool, but it was flexible. and they were able to intertwine this gold thread, solid gold thread, with blue wool and with scarlet wool, and intertwine it together. And they were able to hammer out solid gold into the menorah, into the angels, the cherubs, etc. And it took tremendous talent, divine talent. Now, who was the architect? Who was the chief? Who was the chief builder? So, the chief builder was, his name was Bezalel. The Torah gives us a name, Bezalel. So Bezalel means in the shade of God, in the shadow of God. Bezalel was clearly divinely inspired. Right? In fact, anybody with a talent is divinely inspired, and we all have different talents, right? We all have different things that we can offer. Nobody's created redundant. Everybody's created with a purpose. And Bezalel was incredible. He was able to take all these artifacts, and he was a great. He relegated and delegated it to the correct people. And he also had a good vision of how it should be done. Now, the Torah tells us that Bezalel was the son of Uri, the son of Hur. He was the grandson of Hur. Who was Hur? So we know the tabernacle was made because of the sin of the golden calf. Now, the Hur, Bezalel's grandfather, was killed, was assassinated when he tried to stop. He tried to stop the making of the golden calf, and he was assassinated by the rebel rousers. In order to correct this assassination, his grandson was honored with making the tabernacle. So when they say, the chickens come home to roost, here's a positive sign. Here's a positive, right? This is karma. You killed his grandfather because he tried to stop the sin of the golden calf. And now you need his grandson to help you atone. Anyway, people brought from gifts, and they kept on coming to the point where Moses had to say enough, enough, enough. This is probably the only fundraiser. Moses was the best fundraiser there was. Moses worked for the UJA, or was the first person to work for the UJA, and but he was the best fundraiser because he got more than what was needed. The Chai Center, I'm always behind the 8 ball. If I had Moses as a 1099, it would be unbelievable. So people brought, and the men and the women, and it says the women came together, and in front of Moses, they took off their bracelets, their necklaces, their earrings, their nose rings, their kumas, which was golden undergarments, and they just gave it. They gave it as a gift to God. And sometimes, as the Torah tells us, it was Nadiv Lev. It was Nadiv Lev. These people gave they gave their jewelry that they've had possibly from their grandparents. It was very sentimental to them, but they gave that away. They just gave it, and everything was given. Everything was given. And Moshe said enough. Now, then the princes, each tribe had a prince, a leader. The princes decided between themselves that they're going to wait till everybody has brought what's needed. And the princes, on behalf of their tribes, are going to bring the rest. So it didn't happen. Everybody brought, and Moses was enough. There was nothing left. There's nothing left for the princes to offer. And that just shows you they were behind the ball, the 8 ball. They were late to the game. They were tardy. While they had good intentions, the Torah, and it's the very first Jewish law in the code of Jewish law, is you got to move with alacrity. You have an opportunity to do God's will. You got to move with alacrity. You cannot be a snail here, right? So they were tardy. They left it till late, and they were bereft. They had nothing to offer. So they went to Moses and they said, "What can we offer?" So Moses says, "You know what? I'm missing something. I am missing something. I need two onyx stones, large onyx stones, to be placed on the high priest on the two shoulders." So 12 priests together brought two onyx stones. And Moses told them, it's a lesson. It's a lesson. You need, it's a lesson to the Jewish people. You cannot be tardy. The Torah tells us that Bezalel, who was the architect, he was lachshay machshavos. He was able to ascertain the thoughts in man. So when people brought these gifts, he was able to ascertain what they were thinking. He was able to ascertain if they had really pure thoughts, then this gold went to the holy of holies, the cherubs. If they didn't have such pure thoughts, then it went to something lesser. He was able to divine, through divine wisdom, he was able to ascertain who was where everything should go. He had a partner, Oliov, and together they assembled all the riches, and they told Moshe enough, and Moshe said enough. Now, that doesn't mean that people stopped giving, but Moshe made it clear, just for integrity's sake. Moshe said, whatever we have now is enough to build. You want to give more? So that's going to be used for repairs later. That's going to be used for the communal sacrifices. That's going to be used for this, that, and the other, for additional things that we may need. But right now we have enough. And the people continue to bring and bring and bring. So the Torah tells us that they started to make everything. They started to make the curtains. They started to make the boards. Remember, they made the home first, and they started to make the boards. They started to make there was different curtains, one on top of the other, that served as the roof, from different types of animals. And you may ask, why did they need this? Why wasn't one curtain enough? So the first answer to that, this is God's command. The second thing is that God wanted to elevate different animals and different prototypes of animals. So goats elevated the goats. The tachash, whatever that was, elevated the tachash. Now God told them and the purple wool elevated all purple wool, scarlet wool purple. God gave them the dimensions. God gave them what he wanted. So they made two goat's wool covers. And God said, I want 50 loops to go around 50 pegs. So that way you can loop them together. It was God. God gave the dimensions. Not only here, what's interesting is God gave the dimensions to Solomon to build the temple. So it wasn't Solomon said, I'm going to make it this size and this size, or I like this, I like it. I want it to cantilever, and I want a beautiful fountain, and I want it to look like, a place in the Mirage in Las Vegas. God decided how it wanted to look. God decided the fractions of the ark. I want the ark to be so and so big, 6.3. It was God. It was all God. And while we perhaps can't necessarily understand why God had wanted a board 18 feet wide, right? Big piece of wood, 18 feet wide, right? We don't know, but God obviously had a plan. The Torah tells us how he made this and how he made that, everything to spec, and the size that he made it, and the little crown that he made, how big it was to be. He made the menorah out of one block of wood, and one block of gold. I'm sorry, and the menorah was solid gold. And the reason why, by the way, they tell us that the menorah was solid gold as opposed to being mixed in with other things is because the menorah symbolized mitzvahs, reaching out and giving somebody light, spiritual light, physical light, compassion, whatever it may be. And that you can't cheapen. That you need solid gold. Just like the ark, the cherubs on top was solid gold because the cherubs were children. Children need to be attached to Torah, to values, to ethics, not nonsense, right? And therefore, you can't cheapen that either. You cannot. We're talking about a kid's attachment to God. You can't cheapen that. So that was also solid gold. And God dictated once again how everything was to be made, and everything was made. Pekudei, the second portion, is where they started. Moses said, "Okay, we need an accounting. We are just like the Chai Center. We have to do we have to have a financial statement, right? Financial statement is given to the bank. Financial statement is given to the chairman and the president, right? You have to have a financial statement. An architect comes in and does a statement. Why? Because you raise money. You raise money from the public. You have to show integrity. So therefore, Moses too, nobody should be beyond reproach. So there was a tally made. And Moses and the committee of Bezalel and Oliov, they, by the way, doesn't Oliov sound like the in Frozen, right? That character in Frozen. They made a tally and they said how much gold they accumulated and how much silver they accumulated, etc. And now, and they counted everything up, and they had a proper recording. It's interesting that everything was certain things were made in, as it says, the Torah tells us, and they made this and they made this and they made this. Sometimes it says, and he made it. Sometimes it says, and they made it. And the reason for that is that there was some things that for example, generally things that the Kohen Gadol wore, the high priest wore, that was different to what the regular priest wore, that you had Bezalel himself make. So the me'il, the robe that had bells on at the bottom, Bezalel made. Right? The tzitz, which is the golden plate, was made plurally. And we discussed this yesterday in temple, is that when on the tzitz, on this little gold plate that was placed on the Kohen, the high priest's forehead, was written holy to God. Now, to God is to God. It had two, Lamed, and then it had the name of the tetragrammaton, the name of God. Yud K and Vav K. And they didn't know what to do. Because you write the letter Yud, that's fine. You engrave the letter Yud. Then you write the letter Hey, you have God's name. And we know you're not allowed to erase God's name in any way, shape, or form. Once you write the next letter of God's name, the Vav, you've now taken the name of God and ruined it. Because Yud and a Hey and a Vav is not God's name. Yud and a Hey is. Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey is. But Yud and Hey and Vav is not. And then you write the name of God. The second Hey, the fourth letter, is the name of God. So they weren't sure how to do it without disrupting God's name for a moment. So what they did was they got 4 people to engrave together exactly at the same time. One wrote the Yud. At the same time, the person wrote the Hey. One wrote the Vav, and one wrote the Hey. And that's why it says, and they made. Anyway, it was complete. It was fully complete. the everything, and they brought it to Moshe, and Moshe blessed them. This blessing that he blessed them is actually every time a new synagogue is built, every time a new mikveh is built, anytime a new yeshiva is built, anytime something holy is built, we actually say these words, the same words Moshe said, to the Jewish people. And these words are as follows: Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will, Shetishra Shechina, that God's divine presence, God's concentrated presence, should dwell b'maseh yedechem, in the works of your hands. In other words, what you're building now should be holy, and Hashem should want to live in it. So I remember when we built the mikveh, the rabbi was here that was just came to start off the process. So he said this, Rabbi Katz, and he cried when he said it. He said, we're about to build one of the holiest things we as human beings can do, a mikveh. And he says, may it be holy, may it truly be holy. May holiness come from this mikveh. So when a woman goes to mikveh, which is a holy act, and then she reunites with a husband, a holy act, and then a child is born from this union, the holiest act, may it all be holy. And he cried. So now I think this is a profound lesson. You know, there are things that we do that don't bring holiness in the world. But if we think about it, we if we really think about it, we would assure that we shouldn't do it, because we have the ability, we humans, mortal, flesh and blood, people who need the showers daily, can bring holiness into the world, and that God's divine presence shall rest. I'm hoping he's resting on this Zoom right now. So Moshe blessed them, and basically it's whatever you do, may the divine presence rest. It was on the first day of the first month, which is today. Today is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. The first day of the first month, for the very first time, the Mishkan was put together. Moshe put it all together himself, however big it was. It was a miracle. Moshe put it all together, and everything was set in its correct place. And it was done. It was complete. It took place today, 3,300, and I think 39 years ago, maybe 3,340 years ago. Today is the anniversary of when it was put up. On that day, the first sacrifice was offered. It was offered by Nachshon, the son of Aminadab, from the tribe of Judah. He was honored to give the very first sacrifice in the holy Mishkan. And the reason why he was honored is because when the Jews left Egypt a year before, 11 and a half months before, and they were caught by the sea, by the Yam Suf, by the Sea of Reeds. Remember, Red Sea is a mistake. It's really a Sea of Reeds. R-E-E-D, not R-E-D. And God said, travel. And the Jewish people said, where? And Moshe said, travel. And they said, where? And it was Nachshon who said, he wants us to travel. He wants us to go in the water. And he went in the water, and as he went in the water, and he became nearly fully submerged, the sea split. Because he was the first one to jump in, had the faith, he was the first one to offer the sacrifice. Each day, after he offered the sacrifice, towards the end of the day, it was dismantled. The next day, and this went on for a week, the next day, Moshe put it up again. The end of the day, it was dismantled. On the 8th day, Moshe and Aaron and the sons put it up together. They offered a sacrifice together. And then Moshe stepped away from being the Kohen, and he handed over the leadership to Aaron. So it was a transition period. In the United States, the president, the new president, is elected November, but steps down on January 20. Why? Because you have to have a transition period. We're not going to talk about this transition period, which was a mess. But so here, there was a transition period, but it was only 7 days. On the 8th day, Aaron stepped up, and Aaron and his sons took over. And so today was the anniversary, as I said, of the first time it was put up. And on the 8th day, it became final. Moshe took out the tablets, the broken ones and the whole ones, and he put it, this is on the first day, not on the 8th day, he put it into the special ark, because Moshe had his own ark. When God gave him the tablets, Moshe didn't want them just laying on the floor of his tent. So Moshe made a wooden ark, and that's where he placed them. He finally, on this day, took it out of his ark and put it in the one that was made for God. And they did everything they were told, and it was complete. As soon as it was complete, a divine cloud, and it was apparent, it was this huge cloud, descended over the Mishkan, over the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, which was the Mishkan. And the cloud was so thick, it was a fog. And at that time, the Jewish people knew that God was dwelling amongst them. However, it was so thick and it was so holy, Moshe could not go in. It was like a brick wall. So God lifted the cloud a little bit, so it was hovering above the tent of meeting. And then Moshe went in, and he was able to connect with God. And the cloud stayed there above the tent of meeting, above the Mishkan, until it was ready in the desert, as opposed to Jerusalem or Shiloh. It was this Mishkan traveled. So whenever the cloud moved, the Jewish people knew it was time to move to their next destination, to elevate another part of the world. And then when it stopped, they stopped and they built it quickly, rebuilt it again, etc. But as long as that cloud was there, above the tent of meeting, they knew God wanted them to be there. Now, sometimes the cloud was there 19 years, sometimes it was there a month, sometimes it was there a week. They never knew. But what they did know is they had to follow it, which is such a lesson in our lives. Everything is divine providence. I met you, you met me, you met each other, because God's cloud brought you here, brought you to one another. It wasn't happenstance. It's not random. We travel throughout our life, whether it's figuratively or literally, because we are following this cloud of God. God nudges us in a direction here and a direction there. And as we saw, the Jewish people didn't make a move without God. The reality is that we don't make a move without God. We may think, oh yes, I got to go to Chicago on a business trip. But really, you're going for a business trip and because God wants you to go on a business trip. And that's why the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that wherever you are in the world, you're on vacation, you're in Sedona, you're in Grand Canyon, right? You're in Berlin airport. I say the airport because just use Berlin as a stopover. Try not to give money to Berlin. You're in the Berlin airport, right? Say a prayer, right? Buy a cup of coffee and make a blessing, right? they traveled in the desert in order to accomplish, to elevate different parts of the desert. We got to do the same in our desert. So you're in the Sahara Desert, you're in the Mojave Desert, you're in the Palm Springs Desert. Right? You're there because your individual cloud of glory took you there. Make the most of it and make sure that God's divine presence should rest on your hands. God bless. Have an awesome, awesome week. And tomorrow morning, please God, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, please God, we'll have a class on Facebook. Just one quick pitch. Pesach is coming. It's very important that you clean the house for chametz. Start cleaning the house, thinking about where that there's no chametz in your house, etc. Make sure that you also fill out a form, which can be found on the Chai Center's website, chaicenter.com, to sell your chametz. That you don't own it. You're not allowed to have it. You're not allowed to own it. You're not allowed to eat it. So to make sure you don't eat it, you push it to the side and clean up. To make sure you don't own it, you need to fill out a form. So go to the website. It will say sell your chametz. Fill that out. Very important thing to do. God bless.